Yeah, my parents were both Christians when I was born. They had an amazing story, really. They both became believers within 10 days of each other, without the other one knowing that they had, at a church in London called St Helens Bishopsgate, which is just crazy. So they got married and then told each other after, while they were away on honeymoon, that they both become believers. And that was, I guess, the first miracle of my existence, coming along 4 years later. And so I'd grown up, but I'd actually then swung from being in quite a conservative, reformed Anglican church when I was a baby, then into a sort of charismatic commune context in the early 80s, which was my first memory of church, then back to an Anglican context, and then into a New Frontiers church, which is where I am now. So had quite a sort of pendulum-ish experience of, and I think in some ways those influences of being quite charismatic and had a lot of reformed theology as well have probably both formed me ever since. But so that's how I grew up into that, did what a lot of people do, lived a bit of a two-faced life as a teenager, but really came back to God in my last year at university when I was 21. So that's when I started living as a Christian for real. Well, I actually did study theology my last year at Cambridge, but it probably wasn't then. Oddly, it was, in some ways, the year I learnt the most theology was 2 years after finishing in Cambridge. I did a gap year working for a local church in Eastbourne, which is where I'm still one of the pastors. But for the next 2 years after that, I worked as a management consultant in London, and I spent a lot of my time reading theology on the tube, on my way commuting to Rayners Lane and Harrow and at one point Market Harbour and places like that. And I was just devouring big academic times, and in many ways learned much more theology in those 2 years as a management consultant than I had in my year of university study of it, which is weird, but it's just the way it worked out. And I think by the end of that 2 year period, the interest wasn't just at an academic level, it was a real desire to spend a lot more time doing it. So I moved down to work for the church I'm working at now and to get married, and my job grew from running a gap year program for 18-year-olds, and gradually working for Kids Club. I studied a master's, and bits kept being added on to my job, so that by the time I was 30, which was 6 years ago, I'd become an elder or a pastor in my church. So it was a very gradual journey really over that period of time, but I wrote my first book when I was 27, and that's probably when I started having a bit of a wider sort of ministry as well. Well, I drafted a few kind of devotionals on the character of God for the first book, which eventually became the book Incomparable, which was published in 2006 or something like that, 2007 maybe. But I ended up writing it because my wife was going to go and work as an intern for a human rights organisation, International Justice Mission in Washington, DC. So we spent the summer out there, and in order for me to have something to do, I spoke to the guy who was employing me at the time, a pastor, and said, what do you think if I was to go and try and write something and spend a decent chunk of time out there? So I was out there for nearly 2 months in the oppressive heat of a Washington summer. She was working as an intern in a human rights organisation. I was writing a theology book. And that's kind of how it started, and it went well, and the book sold well, and the publishers wanted to do more stuff. And I actually also had a very powerful prophetic word from a guy who came up and just spoke over me in a room full of leaders. He didn't know me at all. I'd never spoken to him. And he just said, over your life, I just see manuscripts. I think you're going to disciple a generation in truth and write books and this stuff. And I was really blown away because that morning had an email from the publishers saying, we would like to publish this book. So it was an amazing sense of confirmation from God that it was something I thought I should do with my life. And ever since then, I've just really, when I've had time, I've been writing, and sometimes writing even when I don't quite have time. And so there's been that sort of more popular theology, and in the last 5 years I've also been studying a PhD, doing a bit more academic theology as well. Well, I'm very privileged because I don't actually lead the church team that I'm part of, so the leader of our church, Graham Marsh, is the guy who actually leads the team, and I serve as part of a team of elders, 6 of us, so I don't have to carry the can for an awful lot of the decisions that get made, which is great. And I think from very early on he spoke to me when I was about 25 and said, I don't know how this is going to work, but I think maybe you're going to be a resource sort of person. I don't know what it looks like, but I think we should give you time to read and write. And he's always been fantastically supportive of that aspect of what I do. So I preach, nearly half the time in my church in Eastbourne, but the rest of the time I've actually got fewer day-to-day pastoral responsibilities, at least at the moment, than most people who are in pastoral work. So I've actually got more time set aside for some of those things, and I do a lot of blogging and writing and reading and training and that sort of thing as well. I'm going to speak tonight on the subject of individualitis and the dung gate. And basically there's a chapter in Nehemiah that everybody hates because it's just a list of names. And I think there's something very powerful about this particular list of names and what it shows us about how the very mundane, trivial, ordinary things that we all do matter enormously in God's economy, but we don't realize they do because we tend to think we need to lead dramatic, earth-shattering lives. And actually, God doesn't really want it that way, and most of us are not called to do that. We're actually called to lead very little, unseen, ordinary lives in a way that together does something powerful. And I think the heart for that for me is a lot of it's come out of our own story, having children with special needs and having both of our kids having regressed for 2 years and been autistic, and me having to rewire a lot of my life in order to adapt to that, and my wife even far more so, really. And seeing, I suppose, some of how God has led us on that journey and how close to the experience of many other people who get mugged by life in various different ways, I've found it's actually been quite helpful to connect biblical teaching with our own story and the kind of ordinariness of what most of us spend most of our time doing. And I'm hoping in being able to preach on that tonight to be able to hopefully liberate some people perhaps and help share some encouragement that will put people in a position where they're better able to see what God's doing in their situation.
Well, that was very nice and nearly atones. That was a completely true story about the ladies' loos, and some of you were there. I'm really sorry. I went into one and then turned around and came out and thought that's the ladies because I could see the sign, and so went into the adjacent one thinking that's obviously the men's and walked up and then nope, yet more women. It's actually the same block. It's designed to catch people out when they're on their phones. Good evening. Hello. It's nice to be here, and thank you for having me. If you have a Bible, do you want to turn to Nehemiah chapter 3? And I would be surprised if more than a small number of people have ever heard somebody utter that statement. Could you turn to Nehemiah chapter 3? This is not a normal passage to preach from, but I want to speak on something which weighs heavily on my heart, really, and something which I hope will serve you, and that is the topic of individualitis and the dung gate. Individualitis and the dung gate. That's what I want to speak on today. As you do. And my theory is that a lot of us in this room are tainted by something I'd call individualitis, which is basically the belief that the world is primarily about me. Not as in me, but primarily about us as an individual. The world is mainly about me and what I do and what I achieve, and even if we know that's wrong, on hearing it, we're probably affected by it anyway. And I think that's going to be true in a whole bunch of ways. I think it's true because human beings in general are deluded beings, and we are inclined to think that history is primarily about us. And then on top of the fact that we're human, we are also, most of us, Western people. So most people in this room, British people, which would be the majority, although many guests with us as well from other nations, most British people will also have a sense of individualitis because we don't just believe the world is all about human beings, we believe the world is all about British human beings. So our Olympic ceremony montage, do you notice it was wonderful, wasn't it? The world was benighted and green. And then British people discovered the Industrial Revolution and everybody cheered. And then there was a pause and then we went to war and British people won the war and everybody cheered. And then it all went quiet for a while and then British people discovered the NHS and everybody cheered. Do you remember that? You watched it, right? Yeah. And it's that very kind of Anglo-centric, individualistic way of reading history. This is basically my nation and the powerful, wonderful things that I've done. So if you're a human, you're probably a bit of an individualist. If you're a Western human, you're probably more so. And I'm afraid if you are a younger or a richer or more successful Western human, you've probably got it even worse than anybody else. Because younger and richer people often don't yet realize that the world isn't mainly about them. Young people because they haven't found out yet, and rich people because they've managed to live life in a way that's reinforced their wrong belief. And this is one thing we do. We say to people, we say to young people anyway, the world is your oyster. And we stand back significantly. And actually it takes somebody to say, it really isn't. The world is not your oyster. Actually the world is an enormous dark ocean and there are billions of oysters in it. And most of them don't know who any of the other oysters are, and there's also a lot of sharks out there who are trying to eat them. That's what the world is. It's not your oyster at all. Most of the world don't know you're there. Most of the world don't care you're there, and that's okay. It's actually liberating, as we'll hopefully see in a moment. And so I think the chances are that there's quite a lot of individualitis in this room. Here's some ways of telling, okay? This will be a little checklist. Does this affect me? Destiny. If you tend to think, I have a destiny, you are probably an individualist. If you tend to think, we have a destiny, you probably aren't. Scripture. You read the Bible and think, this is for me, you're probably an individualist. If you think, this is for us, you probably aren't. The church. Theme of this event together that we're spending time studying really from so many different angles. If you see the church as optional and not essential, you're probably an individualist. I met a person in a garden center a few years back, and I said to me, I knew her from before, and I just said, so tell me, what kind of church are you in? And she said, we're in an organic church. And I was like, do you mean made of carbon? What are we talking about here? Non-genetically modified. I don't understand the language. And it transpired what it meant was really we're not in a gathered church at all because actually I can relate to God independently of the gathered church. Well, that's probably a sign of individualism. The gospel. As you summarize the gospel, you never mention Israel and you never mention the church, ever, you've probably got individualitis. Because probably the idea is, this is God and me and another person and God and them and then save and heaven and lovely. And actually, the gospel is one for a people, and the gospel is one for the world through that people. Maybe gifts. This is another way of testing. If your take on your gifts is, when you go to a new place, I've got this gift. How are they going to use it? That may mean you're an individualist. If you go and say, the church has this need, how can I serve it? You probably aren't. You see, body parts don't function independently of what the body needs. Now, we don't turn up and sort of say, hey, by the way, I'm a thumb, and I've always been a thumb. Now, how can I fit in and just stick a thumb on here? You turn up and you say, what need does this body have? Oh, actually, it'd be great if you could be a knee, because we're lacking a knee right now. And you go, that's fine, I'll be a knee. That's how the body is intended to think about serving the benefit of others. Maybe evangelism. This is another test. When you hear Jesus say, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Do you imagine a man sitting like a gnome with a fishing rod like this on his own? Follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. We sit there and go, it's all very quiet, and then occasionally, got one. Or do you imagine a whole village with children, men, women, 30 or 40 people all throwing out a net together and reeling it in as a massive group community activity? You may find that's another indicator. We could go on and on. We could talk lots of different examples. If you think that the world changes through individuals rising up, the great man, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, William Wilberforce, probably individualitis, although it's popular. Actually, the vast majority of the world-changing events happen because of huge networks of unseen, unknown people who are funding and praying and supporting and encouraging and writing and campaigning, and a few of them get heard of and make a speech. But their role often isn't even as important as some of the others. It's just the one you know. We could use lots of examples like this when you could say, well, what's the problem? What does that matter? Here's the problem. This is a quote from the church historian Carl Trueman, and I think it's very smart. He says this: the belief that we are special, this is going to upset a few people. The belief that we are special is by and large complete tosh. Most of us are mediocre, make unique contributions only in the peculiar ways we screw things up, and could easily be replaced as husband, father, employee by somebody better suited to the task. Yet, far too many Christians have senses of destiny that verge on the messianic. The confidence that the Lord has a special plan and purpose just for them shapes the way they act and move. But put bluntly, when I read the Bible, it seems to me that the church is the meaning of human history, but it's the church as a corporate body, not the distinct individuals who make up her membership. And my special destiny as a believer is to be part of the church, and it's the church that's the big player in God's wider plan and not me. I think that's pretty wise. I think it's insightful. In other words, our destiny is corporate. The scriptures are the story of a corporate people. The church is corporate, and it will outlast all of us. Me, you, Guy Miller, Dave Smith, Sam Aubrey, Westpoint, New Frontiers, etc. The gospel is corporate. In you and your seed, all the nations will be blessed. Our gifts are corporate. Each one must be done for building up. Evangelism is corporate. Cultural change is corporate. And for all of those reasons, individualism needs to be punched on the nose. Nehemiah 3. Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brothers the priests, and they built the sheep gate. They consecrated it and set its doors. Sorry, I've just realized this translation is different from the one I'm using, which is probably going to be very annoying. In fact, I can read it from here. Wonderful, I'll do that, okay? Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gates. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah. But if you don't know what's going on here, they're building a wall. That's all you care about right now, okay? This is going to be long, so make yourself comfortable, and spare a thought for the signers for the deaf. They laid its... In fact, let's give a round of applause for the signers for the deaf. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Meremoth, the son of Uriah, the son of Hakoz, repaired the next section. Next to him, Meshullam, son of Berechiah, the son of Meshezabel, made repairs. And next to him, Zadok, son of Baana, also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles wouldn't put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. The Jeshanab gate was repaired by Joiada, son of Paseah, and Meshullam, son of Besodeah. They laid its beams and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place, and next to them repairs were made by men from Gibeon and Mizpah, Melatiah of Gibeon and Jadon of Meronoth, places under the authority of the governor of Trans-Euphrates. You've all been there. Uzziel, son of Harhiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. You didn't know they had perfume makers in 5th century Israel, did you? Perfume makers, goldsmiths. They restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Rephaiah, son of Hur, ruler of a half district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section. Adjoining this, Jediah, son of Harumaph, made repairs opposite his house, and Hattush, son of Hashabniah, made repairs next to him, and Malchiah, son of Harim, and Hashub, the son of Pahath Moab, repaired another section, and the Tower of the Ovens. Shalom, son of Halahesh, ruler... What a winning first name that is. Ruler of a half district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. Women all pitching in. So the whole community is building a wall. We got that so far. Don't take it away. There's plenty more. We're less than halfway through. Thank you. Thank you, invisible man at the back. The valley gate was repaired by Hanun and the residents of Zanoah. They rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. They also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the dung gate. I just want you to imagine the aroma of the dung gate in the Middle East in the summer. The dung gate was repaired by Malchiah, son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem. He rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. The fountain gate was repaired by I'd rather do the fountain gate personally than either the dung gate or the fish gate. Fountain gate was repaired by Shallun, son of Kolhoseh, ruler of the district of Mizpah. He rebuilt it, roofing it over, putting its doors and bolts and bars in place. He also repaired the wall of the pool of Siloam by the king's garden, as far as the steps going down from the city of David. Beyond him, Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, ruler of a half district of Beth Zur, made repairs up to a point opposite the tombs of David, as far as the artificial pool and the house of the heroes. That Nehemiah, by the way, is not the Nehemiah who is the subject of the book. That's a different Nehemiah, okay? So this is a Nehemiah we otherwise don't know. Next to him, the repairs were made by the Levites under Rehum, son of Bani. Beside him, Hashabiah, ruler of half the district of Keilah, carried out repairs for his district. Next to him, the repairs were made by their fellow Levites under Binuif, son of Henadad, ruler of the other half district of Keilah. Next to him, Ezer, son of Jeshua, ruler of Mizpah, repaired another section from a point facing the ascent to the armory as far as the angle of the wall. Next to him, Baruch, son of Zabai, zealously repaired another section from the angle to the end. He zealously repaired another section from the angle to the entrance of the house of Eliashib the high priest. Next to him, Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hakoz, repaired another section from the entrance of Eliashib's house to the end of it. The repairs next to him were made by the priests from the surrounding region. Beyond them, Benjamin and Hashub made repairs in front of their house, and next to them, Azariah, son of Maaseiah, the son of Ananiah, made repairs beside his house. Next to him, Binnui, son of Henadad, repaired another section from Azariah's house to the angle in the corner, and Palal, son of Uzziah, worked opposite the angle and the tower projecting from the upper palace near the court of the guard. Next to him, Pedaiah, son of Parosh, and the temple servants living on the hill of Ophel made repairs up to a point opposite the water gate toward the east and the projecting tower. Next to them, which I assume was not the sort of thing in which you have the projector. I assume a projecting tower has a different meaning in the 5th century. Next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section from the great projecting tower to the wall of Ophel. We're nearly there now. Above the horse gate, the priests made repairs, each in front of his own house. Priests are a little bit lazy. I'm not going all the way down to the fish gate. I'm going to do my front garden. And then go. That's what it sounds like. Next to them, Zadok, son of Immer, made repairs opposite his house. Next to him, Shemaiah, son of Shechaniah, the guard of the east gate, made repairs. Next to him, Hananiah, son of Shelemiah, and Hanun, the sixth son of Zalaph, repaired another section. Next to them, Meshullam, son of Berechiah, made repairs opposite his living quarters. Next to him, Malchiah, one of the goldsmiths, made repairs as far as the house of the temple servants and the merchants, opposite the inspection gate, and as far as the room above the corner, and between the room above the corner and the sheep gate, the goldsmiths and merchants made repairs. Give yourselves a round of applause for listening to Nehemiah 3. Now, it's 445 BC-ish. The exile of Judah, which is the low point of biblical history really, is over. And the people of Israel, under the leadership of Nehemiah, are rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. But this kind of chapter drives a lot of you crazy. And you skip it and don't tell anybody when you read through the Bible in 1 year or whatever it might be. And something in us goes, how terribly pedantic to write down all of these names. Who was writing this down? Why wasn't he building a wall? Why was he writing it down so we had to read about it? And it's difficult. And some of us find ourselves going, I don't understand why this would be here. And I had only ever heard this chapter preached on one other time by anybody other than me. And it was by a sort of loud mega pastor in Seattle. And he used it as an example of Nehemiah's outstanding leadership, which I think with respect is a brilliant example of how individualitis affects the church. Because Nehemiah is not even mentioned in this chapter. The only place Nehemiah, the Nehemiah of the book, is mentioned in this chapter is in the heading at the top of the page, and that doesn't count, and we all know it. It is a list of names of everybody involved who wasn't the title character. In that sense, it's probably the worst place in Scripture to get, goodness, look at what an outstanding leader this person was. Instead, it's a very tedious list of names of every individual involved in the project. The jewelers and tradesmen and officials and religious leaders and perfume makers and goldsmiths who each built little sections of a wall that no longer exists and that probably none of us will ever see. Why did Ezra, or whoever it was, write it all down? Because if he hadn't, you and I would conclude that Nehemiah had basically done it. By his wonderful leadership, he had said, let there be a wall, and there was a wall. And we would have no idea that actually this phenomenally important moment in Israel's history was achieved by hundreds of people that you've never heard of and will never remember. I preach on them and I don't remember their names. There's probably one or two I've just mispronounced despite having preached this before. They are that unknown. And God wants you to know in chapters like this, the way God's purpose has come about is through hundreds of people you've never heard of, thousands, millions, billions of them, and not by one great person who waves a wand and says, let there be a wall. And he wants you to know it so much that he writes a lot of names in a lot of chapters of his book, not just to honor them, but to remind you that that's how God's purpose comes about. So let me explain just for a minute why this wall is important. And why it matters that every individual does their bit of wall, even if it's only the size of this bit of stage I'm on, really, really well. Right? It's not one guy. It's Palal repairing the buttress, and Shallum's daughters working next to the Tower of the Ovens, and Malchiah repairing the dung gate. And again, just imagine the jobs are being given out. Okay, and the next lot is for the Tower of the Ovens. You say, fresh bread, the smell of fresh bread. And they said, now it's the fish gate. You say, fish in the Middle East in the summer. Really? The dung gate. Oh, goodness me. Why was I at the front of this queue? I thought I'd get the Tower of the Ovens or the Tower of the Projection or whatever it was. And all of these guys are getting given their little job. Many of them don't want to do it. And it's not the job they would have chosen, but they do it faithfully. And the reason it matters is this. Jerusalem is God's city. It's where God is going to send his Messiah to speak, to heal, and to die an atoning death for the whole world, and then step out of a tomb on Easter morning and break the power of death forever. And if there is no wall, Jerusalem will be invaded and destroyed. Probably the people of Israel Jesus would have been descended from would have been killed. There would be no city, there would be no people, there would be no land, there would be no hope, there would be no gospel. The reason you and I are here is because these people built a wall. Many other people did lots of things that meant you and I are here as well. But if these people hadn't built a wall, you and I wouldn't be here, because there would be no Jerusalem, there would be no Zion, there would be no hope, there would be no Jesus. That would be bad. I think you can agree. But it's not just that they had to build a wall together. It's that every person in that section had to do every little bit of their brick building as well as they possibly could, because without doing their bit, the whole wall is useless. And this is very important. There is no use whatsoever in building part of a wall. There really isn't. If you're building a city wall, it is the most useless, futile waste of time imaginable. Do you remember the Maginot Line? The Maginot Line, basically, if you don't know what the Maginot Line is, this is a good way of summarizing it. Basically, Europe was about to go to war, and the Allies said, don't worry, we'll build some of a wall. That's what happened. We will build a wall from Switzerland to the Ardennes forest. It wasn't quite a wall, it was a heavily fortified area. But we'll build a fortified section of wall. The Germans will never be able to fight through this section of wall, and as such, there will not be a war in Europe. And as Baldric might have said, but we did sort of have a war, didn't we? And you see, the problem with the plan was that if you build some of a wall, people might just go around the side. And the French and the English had thought of this. And they said, but they won't go around the side, because to the south there's mountains. And that's true, there are, and Switzerland is not easy to conquer. And on the north, they said, oh, they won't go around the north. There's trees. There's lots of trees. And pate. You can't go through the forest. Nobody would go through the trees. And the Germans said, you know what? I think if we drove in between the trees, we might be able to take Paris in the next few days. And they did, and Europe was at war for the next 5 years, and many of our relatives were killed during that war because somebody built some of a wall. Some of a wall. It doesn't do you any good. These people are building a wall piece by piece by piece, and if any one of them has a Maginot Line moment and says, I'm not going to build mine, or mine's going to be shoddy, or I'm going to let it fall down, or to be honest, I'm tired, it stinks around here in the dung gate, I'm going home, the wall would have fallen, the enemy would have captured the city, no gospel for you. This chapter tells us that if we want to see God's promises come about, it takes all of us doing little things that nobody cares about: street sweeping, parenting, managing, administrating, dung gate building, to the glory of God. Individualists and most British people actually ask the question, what am I doing to impact the world for God? And these people said, what are we doing to impact the world for God? And the difference is as wide as the world. When I was preparing this talk, I just couldn't get away from Malchiah, the Dungate man. He was the one that struck me. It might be a different one for you, but for me it was Malchiah. Until today, you've never heard of him. He wasn't on the commission video. We didn't interview Malchiah and say, it's really valuable, training's important. Malchiah, what have you learned? I've learned how to build a dung gate. That's great, Malchiah, thanks. Nobody would talk that way about this man. You didn't know who he was. You've never done a character study on this man. But in his very basic, mundane way, he established the kingdom of God by fixing a dung gate. And I think Malchiah and his dung gate have a couple of things to teach us. One of them is that the role of brilliant leaders and geniuses taking on the world and changing it for the better is probably a lot smaller than we think. The other thing is the role of ordinary people who never appear on videos and never stand on the stage and never get written about, but they build their dung gates and they work in their offices and they raise their children and they pay their taxes